The Mexican Revolution began in November 1910 in an effort to overthrow the 30-year dictatorship of Porfirio Diaz. It grew into a widespread rebellion that eventually would change the structure of Mexico's economy, government, and society. It not only changed the course of history for the Mexican people, but also for my own family. While there are many people who played important roles during this time in Mexican history, none were as key as Emiliano Zapata, Francisco Madero, Porfirio Diaz, and Pancho Villa. Zapata and Villa became war heroes from humble and even troubled backgrounds, who led complicated lives but also led thousands of men into victorious battle and earned their way into world history by fighting for what they believed in. Diaz was a dictator who initially had good intentions for his country, but led his people into poverty and eventual revolt. Madero was a powerful man who stood up to Diaz and dreamed of a successful democracy in Mexico, wanting to win the first free election for president in Mexico's history. While not playing a pivotal role in the Mexican Revolution, my great-grandmother Adelfa Garcia Jacobs was forever changed by those times. This is not only the story of the Mexican Revolution and how it changed a nation, but of my great-grandmother, who was uprooted from her home in Querétaro, Mexico, at the age of 10 to come to the United States. She was the youngest of 12 children, and her father, Jesus Garcia, was at one time the mayor of Querétaro, a small town on the Texas-Mexico border. They were cattle ranchers with thousands of acres on both sides of the border. This made them the enemy of the fighting Mexican revolutionaries, and Jesus feared for his family's safety. They fled to their land in Texas, hoping for a safer place to live a simple life away from the fighting. In 1910, with Porfirio Diaz leading the government and the people restless for change, the Mexican Revolution was on its way and the nation would never again be the same. Porfirio Diaz was an army general who led Mexico to a great victory against Maximilian in the French Revolution. But he was also a strong-willed dictator who took power by force. He developed a stable government that improved the army and rid the nation of crime. He worked hard to modernize Mexico and improve public opinion about Mexico's future. Despite what he tried to portray, Diaz had created a nation of severe social inequalities. 70% of Mexico was still rural, and 90% lived in poverty. 1 out of every 2 children died within their first year from whooping cough, malaria, yellow fever, and other contagious diseases. 84% of the population was illiterate. Diaz established a group of advisors called científicos, who were heavily influenced by French positivism, which means they made scientific advancements but at the cost of the people. He also formed a group called rurales. They enforced the laws very harshly. They made rounds between the villages, wrongly imprisoning commoners and then executing them. In the cities, the gap between rich and poor was immense. Important officials such as bankers, científicos, and the richest landowners lived in comfort and wealth, while the daily life of the native farmers bordered in slavery. The working class, nearly 1 million people, inhabited densely crowded slums full of mud and garbage. Alcoholism was extremely common amongst the poor. Francisco Madero was a rich landowner and planned to beat Diaz in the first free election in Mexican history. However, Diaz rigged the voting and won by cheating. Madero was then imprisoned but soon released. He then fled to San Antonio, Texas. There, he wrote a document that called for a revolt against Diaz. The revolt failed, but inspired other groups to band together, and that is what sparked the Mexican Revolution. Pancho Villa was born on June 6, 1878. His real name was Doroteo Arango. Villa became an outlaw at 16. He shot a wealthy landowner who had supposedly violated his sister. Right before he was to be executed for his crime, Villa fled to the mountains. He could never come back to his village, because if he did, he would undoubtedly be killed. He then became a bandit, and had to live off the things he stole from other people. Villa became a leader in the revolution, bringing together thousands of commoners who became outlaws without the training of regular soldiers, but the cunning of lawbreakers. They also had a reason to fight. They wanted their land back. They fought for their land and killed many hacienda owners. At one point, Villa attracted the attention of Hollywood producers. He was portrayed as a Mexican Robin Hood, and many movies were made about his life and famous battles, including the legendary assault on Columbus, New Mexico. Pancho Villa was assassinated in July 1923. The Mexican people mourned him for his courage and leadership. He had become a legend throughout the world. My great-grandmother lived through the Mexican Revolution. She had to flee her home because her father owned a large amount of land, and that made them the rebels' enemy. They lived in Guerrero, Mexico, and had to move to Laredo, on the Texas side of the border. They had to cross about 70 miles of road to get from one city to the next. My great-grandmother's father, Jesus, crossed the border every now and then to take care of the ranch on the Mexican side. They kept their ranch on the Mexican side because they could still make a profit from it if they tended to it regularly. As difficult as it may sound, the move wasn't terribly hard for them, because they moved just north of the border, and there wasn't much of a change of climate or beliefs. It took a while to get used to, but she adapted fairly well to the American culture. Later she met her future husband, Jose. His family were immigrants also from abroad, but had settled in Texas. Emiliano Zapata was born and raised in Ananequilco, a small Mexican village. His father, Jose Zapata, was a successful leader in the War of Intervention and strongly influenced his son's thinking as a leader. Emiliano was chosen as the leader of his town. However, he was very unhappy because the native farmers were poor, starving, and without their rightful land. He and his brother formed an army of revolutionary forces who became known as the Zapatistas. Zapata, who led many battles in the Mexican Revolution, did not fight for power or political glory. He was a man of the people and fought for their rights as landowners. In 1911, he drew up the Plan de Ayala, his ideal plan for Mexico's future. The plan did not envision the disappearance of the wealthy landowners. They were to give back what they'd taken against the law and accept reasonable reductions in their holdings for the good of all Mexicans. Zapata wanted the landowners and farmers to live in peace. Zapata fought until his life's end for his people's rights. To this day, he is considered mysterious, visionary, and a hero by the Mexican people. During the Mexican Revolution, heroes and villains emerged. Historians estimate the death toll from as low as 350,000 to as high as 1 million. This does not include the 300,000 victims of the flu epidemic in 1918. It was the bloodiest war in Mexico's history, yet some of the greatest leaders arose from the destruction and sadness of that time. Villa and Zapata led armies of vagabonds and farmers to victory against trained soldiers, an amazing feat in itself, but Villa and Zapata also brought about governmental reform. The new regime gave back millions of acres to rural farmers and built schools for Mexico's poor. A new government was formed called the PRI, which is in place until recently. My great-grandmother married Jose Jacobs in 1927. My grandfather, Arturo Jacobs, was their second of 4 children. My great-grandmother never became a U.S. citizen and spoke very little English. While living in the U.S. for most of her life, she was Mexican in her heart and passed on a great love of her heritage to her son, who in turn passed it on to my mom. She died in 1986, before I was born. Guerrero, the Mexican town she lived in, was evacuated in 1953 because of flooding by a nearby dam. Recently, the water dried up from a drought, and the town has been rediscovered by residents and historians. I am also proud to be a descendant of Mexico and realize that without the Revolution of 1910, the chain of events that led my great-grandmother to America wouldn't have occurred, and I wouldn't be here today.